who is joining us here on Zoom tonight, and also those of you who are watching on Facebook. We're so glad to have you here. Thank you for coming. My name is Joanna Bull, and I am the Community Engagement Manager here at the Ecology Action Center. And this webinar is part 2 in our series on mobilizing together for a just and sustainable future. So whenever we're talking about how we're creating the future, it's really important to remember where we're starting from and how we got here. So we need to acknowledge our history, the history of the land where we're standing, and how we came to be standing here. So I am speaking to you from Chibuktuk, the Great Harbor in Mi'kma'ki, which is a territory of the Olnu, or the Mi'kmaq. And since time immemorial, 14,000 years and beyond ago, the Mi'kmaq have lived in this place and taken care of this land and these waters here. And in the last 500 years or so, this land was stolen through colonial violence in order for Europeans to be able to profit from the resources from this land. And that process continues to this day, as does the fierce and dedicated resistance by Mi'kmaq communities who continue to stand up to protect land and water and their sovereign treaty rights. So this place where we live is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship, and we all have a responsibility to uphold the principles and laws of peace and friendship in all that we do, and keep an eye as to how we can right those historic wrongs that many of us still continue to benefit from today. So just wanting to bring that in at the beginning here, and hope that we can carry that in our hearts as we continue our discussion tonight. So as I said, this is part 2 of a 4-part webinar series, and we're talking about how we create a just and sustainable future. And the reason that we're talking about that right now is that we believe that our provincial government will soon be announcing public consultations on our provincial climate plan and the regulations that go along with the Sustainable Development Goals Act. When that happens, we need all of you, our public, our citizens, to be ready to engage in those consultations and to speak up loud and clear for the kind of pathway to the future that we really need to see here in Nova Scotia and Mi'kma'ki. So stay tuned, stay ready. We'll definitely keep you all posted when that comes along. Tonight's webinar and the whole series is meant to spark our imagination and give us some ideas of where is it that we really do need to be heading? What are some of the possibilities of what we can do here in this place to make that future a reality? What are some of the needs of the moment from a policy perspective that we need to be asking from our governments? So if you missed the first episode on community and climate solutions, it was a really fantastic conversation, and it's on our Facebook page. Feel free to go back and watch it, and the link is just in the chat. I highly recommend catching up on that conversation. And then parts 3 and 4 are going to be coming later on in May. The first one, or the part 3 rather, is about protecting the ecosystems that sustain us. And the final piece is about how we can collectively adapt to the climate crisis and the impacts that we're already feeling and that we'll continue to feel here in Atlantic Canada. So please stay tuned for those as well. Tonight, though, we are talking about powering the future. And so this is all about our electricity system and how we can transition. We're going to be getting into some of those nuts and bolts and specifics around what would it really take to meet our targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, those targets that were set in the Sustainable Development Goals Act back in 2019. How would we really reach them? How would we change our electricity system? How can we change the way we're using electricity? And what are some of the benefits that we'll have from those from that transition? So that's what we're getting into tonight with our wonderful panel of folks who's joining us tonight. And here to guide us through that conversation is our wonderful moderator, Erica Butler. So Erica is a journalist with CHMA Radio and is a former transportation columnist with the Halifax Examiner. She's now living in Sackville, New Brunswick, and is interested in how individuals and communities solve problems, from the climate crisis to inequality to social justice. And Erica is our moderator for all 4 webinars for this series, which is super great. So I'll pass it over to you, Erica, to introduce our speakers and bring us into the conversation. Thanks, both.
Thanks, Joanna. I appreciate that. Appreciate the intro. I'm very excited to be here learning along with everybody. And we'll get right to it. There's a few housekeeping notes to begin with for people joining on Zoom. There is closed captioning available, so there should be a button on your screen. Keep it in mind. It's auto-generated, so it's apparently not incredibly accurate, but it's better than nothing. Everyone in the audience has their mics and video off, so don't worry about making sure you're muted. It's all taken care of. If you have questions as we go, please put them in the chat window and we will do our best to get to them in a Q&A session after all our speakers have presented. So we will get to them and the speakers will be around to answer them, but we're going to do Q&A at the end. A note that we're also broadcasting on Facebook Live for those of you who are tuning in on Zoom. And I'm going to give really brief introductions for today's speaker, but just in the, so that we can maximize our time hearing them speak. But if you want to find out more about them, check the bios on the webinar event page. Okay, so let's get started. Our first speaker today is Louise Comeau, Director of the Conservation Council of New Brunswick's Climate Change and Energy Program. Louise is also a researcher and instructor at UNB and an environmental consultant, and has 30 years experience in analyzing and developing climate change policy, communications, and solutions-related programming. Many thanks for joining us, Louise.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Start off. Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. To start off, I'm wondering if you can talk about the big picture vision for the electricity system in Atlantic Canada and the pathway for us to reach our greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets.
Absolutely. And let me just set a couple of elements that I think are good context. One is, even though we're going to talk about electricity tonight, it is not to say that I think that this is the only pathway or that it can happen without investment in social capital and all sorts of other changes that we need at a societal level, whether it's from consumption, thinking our values, and so on. So this is one component of it, an important one. And in that context, just to kind of point out to folks, that in New Brunswick, electricity is responsible for about a quarter of our emissions here in the province, and burning coal is about half of that. In Nova Scotia, based on the latest numbers, I hope I have it right I feel like I'm watching Guru, my teacher here, but I think my numbers suggest at least 40% of provincial emissions and about 70% of that's coming from coal. So that's a lot of reasons right off the top to think about electricity. But add in pressure to cut greenhouse gases more deeply by 2030, the fact that we've got federal regulations to phase out coal by 2030, that there's a national goal of a 90% emissions-free electricity system by 2030. You might see a theme there. And the potential for a new national clean electricity standard. And you've got a pretty strong rationale for why we need to think about developing and implementing an electricity vision. We need to do it not only to respond to the changing political and regulatory environment, but because the pathway to a clean future is, in fact, a more electrified economy. So knowing that we have to manage on the one side and grow on the other side, CCNB and the Ecology Action Center worked together over the last year to build an Atlantic vision focused on this idea of how do we move toward this cleaner electricity system that we want to see, and do so in a way that ensures that citizens get what they want, and that is an affordable electricity system that's reliable, so that's there when they need it, but also is clean in terms of effects on our health and obviously on the planet. And so for us, that definition of what an electricity vision or clean electricity looks like, I think it's important to define it because there are definitions out there that differ from what we looked at. And for us, it does focus more on non-polluting sources like wind, solar, existing hydro, new and emerging storage technologies, and critically that any electricity we used is used very efficiently. And so that means we're not talking about large-scale hydro. Obviously, lots of reasons why there would be concerns there. Certainly not as confident in the idea of small modular nuclear reactors or blue hydrogen as solutions in the short term, particularly in the case of SMRs, which is a big issue here in New Brunswick because of the cost and reliability concerns. What we did in order to kind of build this vision, and I think Guru's put the link to it on the CCMB website, is we obviously do what good campaigners do. We started with research, and the technical analysis we had done really confirmed something important, which is that in 80% of the plans, the utility plans that we looked at, both in the US and Canada, 80% of the plans we looked at that within those plans, the clean portfolios, the renewable, efficient, so on portfolios, were actually cheaper than or comparable to the more polluting scenarios. So in other words, our challenge and our pathway is not laden with challenges from technology so much as it is from political barriers. And I'll say a couple of words about that before I end this intro to these ideas. And one of the key ones that I've really come to appreciate in the last while is just how strategic an asset electricity is going to be in a decarbonized world. And it's not yet treated that way. Strategic assets need to be more than an engineering challenge. It's not just the story of poles and transmission lines and turbines and so on. Electricity is essential to our capacity to change the world and create the world we want to live in, and therefore something very worthy of attention from the political elite. And that's kind of the conclusion we came to in the work that we've done, is that the main barrier that we face to reaching our goals is lack of political will. It is not a technology problem. And so when we're hearing about ideas of particular options like nuclear or large hydro or building an Atlantic loop, which is really a transmission link bringing the Atlantic provinces and Quebec together, we need to think more about not just technology, but the role that electricity is going to play in our society and in our life and as a solution to climate change. So barriers that we identified, and I'll just introduce these ideas and go a little bit deeper in a moment, but our legislative and regulatory, so the political side of things, but we also have problems that we can't ignore. If we're going to change electricity, we have to deal with the fact that utilities have debts, that they have issues around closing units that are polluting, but also generate revenue, potentially in favor of buying electricity, say, from Quebec or Newfoundland, Labrador, as is clearly part of our conversation. And also to manage costs in the transition so that we aren't putting an unfair burden on lower income households and so on. So there are real issues that have to be managed. We shouldn't sugarcoat that. And as a result, there are things I think we need to do that begin to overcome those.
Thanks so much, Louise. I mean, I'm piqued my interest with sort of talking about those hurdles that we're facing. I mean, in terms of political will, it does seem like the big ticket items, a large scale hydro project or nuclear just seems like it could sort of, it's I guess, politically enticing to the leaders because they feel that they can offer a solution more cleanly. What sort of, what are we looking at in terms of supplying that vision? And I guess what are, talk a bit more about those hurdles, and I guess more importantly, what the policies are we're going to need to look at to help overcome them.
Okay, so I guess just let me comment on your reference to the nuclear issue, which is particularly a New Brunswick on the Atlantic side of it. Obviously, Ontario and Saskatchewan and Alberta seem to be also interested in this idea. But in the context of New Brunswick, the challenge is that the current government doesn't feel any pressure to reduce emissions because through industrial restructuring in the province, emissions have fallen, currently in line with federal targets and likely to remain in line with whatever the new federal target's going to be that we take to COP26 in November as part of the UN negotiations. And so they're thinking, 10, 15 years from now, something will come on and that, that'll be great. It'll allow us to do some economic development here. And that is just not useful thinking. And so this is why I mentioned the issue of political will. The fact of the matter is the planet has less than 10 years in terms of thinking in concrete ways about the limitations imposed on humanity as a result of the global carbon budget. So we need to be at zero in the next 10 to 15 years and not do what New Brunswick's doing currently, which is planning to run its fossil fuel plants for a long time to come. One of the things that happened when we did our second set of studies with East Coast Environmental Law was I actually learned something really important that, in fact, to reinforce with your viewers that our problem is not technical. It is most definitely a question of legislative and regulatory barriers that need to be dealt with. So what we found when the very capable Tina Northrup did the analysis for us was that the utilities, through their electricity acts and the legislation that manages the utility boards, are literally limited in what they can consider, and it is restricted to basically only financial costs to utilities and ratepayers. They don't consider the environment, they don't consider the social things, the things that matter most in so many ways. And so if we're going to move forward with electrification of our economies and getting to a clean future, then we need to deal with the fact that we need legislative and regulatory reform. We also, as you're talking about in Nova Scotia, right, looking at deeper policy commitments, more regulatory commitments, making a commitment to higher levels of renewable energy, for example, something not under discussion here in New Brunswick. So we need all of those things to change: the Electricity Act, the Energy Utilities Board Act. We need stronger policies in place, but we also, I think, need more transparency and participatory decision making. I know that for those of you who are living and working and doing advocacy work in Nova Scotia, you want more, but where I sit in New Brunswick, I think I wish we were more like Nova Scotia, because it's not the same here at all. So let me give you an example. The two provinces engaged in a process to develop what we call an integrated resource plan, where they look at demand and supply and all those things. Lays out their long-term thinking. And basically, New Brunswick did an online survey and popped out their IRP. It was not like that in Nova Scotia. It was very, very extensive process and engagement and public sharing of background documents. And it was a delight to read that IRP. Of course, we want to see it implemented, or even more done than currently planned. And so in terms of fixing that, we currently have, a number of studies underway by provinces, the federal government, and the utilities, looking at how we move forward in Atlantic Canada on electricity. And none of it's public. Clean Power Pathway reports, they call it, aren't given to us. We don't get a chance to comment or engage. That's kind of, got to go by the wayside. So that's a key policy area that I'd like to see fixed, where we have essentially consistent principles guiding integrated resource planning, consistent principles of public engagement, commitment to legislative and regulatory reform, and even big ideas like doing integrated planning on an Atlantic-wide basis. We need to drive each other forward and put pressure on each other to achieve these objectives of a rapid turnaround, less than 10 years, in our electricity system. And as I mentioned, instead of that, what we have in a place like New Brunswick, and again, I look to Nova Scotia in some ways to help open the thinking here. And that is, of course, that the province here feels little pressure and intends to run its coal plants into the 2040s along with its diesel, oil, and gas plants. And that kind of thinking is really needs to be called out. And so we need social engagement. We need a public that's not also, worried about nuclear, but is worried about the entire electricity system and sees it as a public project, a social project that we all can participate in and change the path forward, because we all see that we have an interest in it. Thank you for that question.
Thanks so much, Louise. Really appreciate that. I want to introduce another speaker for you all today. Next up, we're going to hear from Emma Norton. Emma has a decade of experience in the climate and energy sector. Nova Scotians may recognize her name as an Ecology Action Centre alum. And recently, she started a new position with the David Suzuki Foundation. Emma has implemented local climate solutions, advocated to and worked with all levels of government, and intervened in regulatory processes. Welcome, Emma. To start off, we collectively focus a lot on the way we generate electricity. How much do we have to gain or possibly lose in terms of GHG emissions by focusing on reducing our energy use, either through reduced demand or increased efficiency?
Thanks, Erica. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here tonight. Hello, everyone. Hello to my friends I see in the participants list. I'm virtually calling in from Brunswick, that's Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And I just want to correct, I don't actually work for the David Suzuki Foundation. I work for the David Suzuki Institute on a project called the Climate Emergency Unit. You'll be hearing more about us soon once we get our website and social media up and going. So I have this list of 9 things that we gain, or the 9 positives of energy efficiency that I want to talk about tonight. And I did hear Louise. Thanks, Louise. It was so great to hear your insight. I did hear Louise give a shout out to energy efficiency first in her discussion there. So I just want to talk about the various ways in which it serves us. So energy efficiency is the cheaper option. It's much cheaper to not generate a kilowatt hour than it is to generate one. And actually in Nova Scotia, our programs cost 3 cents to save a kilowatt hour versus 6 cents to generate one. And we also need to think about, as we make the energy transition, we need to build a lot of infrastructure, right? We need to build the renewable energy generation. And the less generation we need to build, the better. So if we can help keep our demand lower, that will help reduce the amount that we need to invest into renewable energy. And in Nova Scotia, it's hard, and probably in the other provinces, it's hard to make that argument to Nova Scotia Power because they make their money by selling kilowatt hours. So when we say we need to invest in energy efficiency, it works entirely against their profit model. So there's a role to be played by the province here in changing our regulator so that the profit model of Nova Scotia Power is based on their performance in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and ensuring reliable electricity, instead of basing it on the amount of electricity that they sell. And that's a model that is being explored in other jurisdictions that we really need to be exploring here. Because in Nova Scotia, we actually approach energy efficiency as a form of energy. So the greenest energy that we have in front of us is the energy we're not using. And in Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia Power is actually, or another way to say it would be a kilowatt hour not used is the greenest form of kilowatt. So in Nova Scotia Power needs to buy energy efficiency from our energy efficiency utility, Efficiency Nova Scotia. So funny to talk about this because you use the same word so many times in one sentence. And the way they're legislated to buy that efficiency is because they're legislated to buy the most cost-effective form of energy, and that's energy efficiency. Another aspect that I really love about energy efficiency is that it's very democratic. Everyone has access to energy efficiency when we're talking about it in incremental ways. Like everyone can turn off their lights, everyone can walk more. And of course, it depends on the kind of privileges you have, how far you can go into that. But here in Nova Scotia, we have some really excellent programs, really heavily advocated for by the Affordable Energy Coalition for those of us in those households that experience energy poverty. So in Nova Scotia, 37% of households experience energy poverty. That's a very high number. And we have some really wonderful advocates in our community that have spoken up to make sure that we can reduce that number and that people don't need to choose between eating and heating their home. And so there's two programs. One of them is home warming, and that's for homeowners that live in energy poverty and have a lower income. They get free energy efficiency upgrades and save between $600 and $1,000 a year. And there's now also a program for tenants, which is really leading in North America. It's very hard to set up energy efficiency programs for renters. And we all know about the housing crisis here in Nova Scotia and how hard it is to pay for rent in general. So it's even more important that we're able to reduce the utility bills of renters. So just shout out to the Affordable Energy Coalition and Brian Gifford in particular for their incredible work on those files. And I think one of the other really great aspects about energy efficiency is that large institutions can and should lead the way. So Department of National Defense is spending a lot of money right now on making sure that all of their buildings across Canada are getting closer to net zero. Our the federal government and the provincial government have also made commitments to hit net zero. And in doing that, it's kind of challenging when we talk about net zero. Sometimes people think of it as just supplying it all with solar or all with renewable energy. But the best way to do it is actually to reduce the energy demand that you're using. And so by those major institutions investing in deep energy retrofits and energy saving measures, they're helping to boost the industry and make it more affordable for the rest of us and create jobs. And here's my shout out to the Sustainable Development Goals Act. We should have an energy efficiency target in Nova Scotia in the Act. We have a renewable energy target. We have a protected lands target. We have a waste diversion target. But why don't we have an energy efficiency one if we're considering it a form of energy? So in Nova Scotia, we hit about 1% of electricity reduction a year. And that's pretty good, but the best in class is 2 to 3%. And I know those sound like small numbers, but it amounts to a lot in terms of greenhouse gas savings and actual energy poverty reduction savings. So it's quite important for us in terms of being able to hit our climate targets. And we can also set those same kind of savings for different kinds of fuel, but I think we all want to just be talking about we don't want to be setting savings targets necessarily for fossil fuels. We want to be eliminating fossil fuels. I also want to point out that energy efficiency can be thought of in terms of adaptation, because a super energy efficient home can stay at like a comfortable temperature for like 4 degrees in below freezing temperatures if they lose their heating source. So the way that we can build homes now, and in Nova Scotia, not in all jurisdictions, but because we have the experts here in Nova Scotia, we can build a home that you could essentially heat with a hairdryer or two for the same price that you would build a conventional 2-code home. In other jurisdictions like PEI, it'd be like 10 or 15% higher, but not the same in Nova Scotia. If you have questions about who to talk to, I'll tell you who to talk to. Because if you're going to build a home, you can afford to build a net zero energy ready home. It's where the price increases are going to come from. That's your granite countertops. It's not investing in energy efficiency. And that home is going to be super, super cheap to heat. It's going to cost just a few $100s. And you're going to be way more comfortable when we have more extreme weather events, which are just inevitably going to happen because of the amount of climate change we're currently locked into. So really encourage that. And then we can also retrofit our existing building stock to have that kind of energy performance, make these buildings much more comfortable to live in. So on a really hopeful note, like energy efficiency, deep energy retrofits, these are things our federal government are talking about. These are things our province is talking about. We're 3rd in the country in terms of energy efficiency, but we have a lot further to go. We need to be more strategic about where we're going. And I also want to point out that we've got some energy efficiency of all these different aspects of the technological the technological challenge that we're facing in transitioning our energy grid, energy efficiency is going to create the most jobs per $1 million invested. So it also makes sense from an economic, just transition standpoint to start thinking about what those jobs are and how we get people into those industries that are predominantly, they're very predominantly heavily, there's more men represented in those industries. So we need to think about how we attract more women to these industries as well. I'm probably over my time, so I'll stop there.
Emma, did I hear you correct in saying that, we should be basically doubling our rate of increased efficiency? Like we're at 1%, you're saying we should be at 2 or 3?
Yeah, that's right.
So, yeah. That's a significant goal. You mentioned having an efficiency target in the new act. What are, some other regulatory changes? Like what is there legal frameworks or regulatory changes that we need to rely on the provincial government to be bringing in this new act so that we can see changes on the ground, like more houses being built where, heating bills are low because that's the way the house is built, not necessarily with granite countertops, but with well insulated walls and that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, in terms of regulatory, the province could set that target. Also at the utility and review board level, we're not currently allowed to bring in arguments around the environment and climate change, and that needs to change. The UARB jurisdiction needs to be extended to include climate change. We have 7 years left in a business as usual scenario. We need to be including greenhouse gases in all of our infrastructural decisions. At the federal regulatory level, our building codes are designed by the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes as a model code, and then the provinces and municipalities adopt them. The federal government asked provinces to commit to net zero energy ready codes by the year 2030, and they're not on track to deliver us that model code by the year, in order for us to be able to do that by the year 2030. It looks like they might give us that model code in 2030, but then it's going to take us a year or two or more to adopt them across the provinces. So they need to be providing us with that opportunity to adopt net zero energy ready building codes faster and sooner. And, we also need to be thinking about aiming for deeper targets. So, at this point, a lot of us have switched out our light bulbs. A lot of us have done some air sealing. What we need to do now is find those really deep savings, and we need to not be just targeting energy efficiency, but we need to be chasing greenhouse gas emission reductions. So that means really targeted efficiency programs, and that means spending what it takes, right? Sometimes we're aiming for just a 10-year payback or a 15-year payback, but when you're in a climate emergency, you need to spend as much money as it takes to get us over that hurdle and into a safer, better future. And so our governments need to be prepared to spend that kind of money. And that means investing in deep energy retrofits of building stock. We've used that word a lot, deep energy retrofits. That means achieving savings of 50% or more in our buildings. And that's not really happening. It's in all of the parties' political platforms. We hear it from lots of advocates, but there are very few examples of deep energy retrofits. EAC has a great example. But they cost a lot of money, and we need to be really strategic and targeted about where we're setting them. Another policy that we need to see is no more hookups. No new construction should be hooked up to fossil fuels. No one should be putting in an oil furnace or a natural gas furnace at this point in time. We're running out of time, and to invest in infrastructure, even at an individual level, doesn't make sense. And the government needs to be the provincial government and the federal government, especially in Nova Scotia, where we're still burning oil to heat our homes, need to be making it as easy as possible for people when they need to replace their heating source to replace with a non-fossil fuel-based heating source.
Thanks so much for that. Thank you. It's a lot to do, but we can do it. Next, I want to introduce you to Ben Grieder. Let me get it. Ben is energy coordinator with the Ecology Action Center, focused on energy efficiency. Ben has worked as a community energy planner and calls himself a different kind of accountant focused on greenhouse gas emission accounting. He's with us today to talk about how our economy will transition along with our energy system. Welcome, Ben. When we talk about transitioning our energy systems, this also means transitioning our economy. What are some of the opportunities for Nova Scotia in terms of green jobs that can come through this transition?
Good question, Erica. And I'm not going to lie, I had this question ahead of time. So I did a little planning. So this is my brain on a wall. As you can see here, there's lots of things, and we're just going to go through this board and talk about it a bit more. There's tons of opportunities, and I'm really glad that I went third so that Emma and Louise could really explain the electricity portion and the energy efficiency portion, so you have a better idea of where we're going, what direction we need to go in order to get these green jobs. So if we invest in energy efficiency, if we invest in clean energy, then more jobs are created. And those jobs can lead to, could lead to 15,000 full-time jobs every year until 2030. As outlined in the Green Jobs Report located on the Ecology Action Center website. If you go on this board, what we have here is we need to start with training. So right now, there are some great programs in Nova Scotia, but there could be more training. Right now, what we are doing is we're preparing people for jobs that will take them to a red seal carpenter or a red seal electrician and getting them to the highest level possible so that they can do everything. But what's interesting and what's really interesting about deep energy retrofits is that we don't need thousands of red seal carpenters. We don't need thousands of red seal electricians. What we do need are people who can put up walls, can do siding, can put insulation in walls. We need a lot of people to do that. What's interesting is, according to the Construction Association of Canada, hundreds of thousands of people are going to retire in the next 10 years. And those people, there's not enough people in Canada right now who are in the professions that they are trained for, such as electricians and carpenters. There's not enough people to actually replace those jobs. And so we need to get creative in how we, in the future, create those jobs and require people to do those jobs. For example, this is a nice green jobs calendar from the Ecology Action Center 2 years ago. And we have some people here, Gabriel Paul and Brett Stevens, shout out to you folks, who put on energy solar panels onto the roof of their First Nation band center. And they did that with a training course that they did along with some electricians, but they did that with some training and some in-community training. One thing that I keep on thinking about when it comes to green jobs in Nova Scotia is that we're not only creating an opportunity to transition our energy electricity grid and increase energy efficiency in Nova Scotia, we're also creating local jobs in our communities. And that, I think, is one of the most important things moving forward. For example, we can have librarians creating new setups in libraries to talk about the green jobs that are created, about the new fields of work that are created. We can have affordable, reliable, clean electricity if we do those things. If we get into clean transportation and bike more, invest in green vehicles, then we can have clean air, healthy communities. But most importantly, we need the funding and investing to do so. So, for example, Ian Rankin and Stephen McNeil, they both announced funding this year for the Affordable Multi-Family Housing Program and the Home Warming Program. Those go a huge way into increasing the amount of jobs that are created in the field. Think about it. If you have cellulose made out of paper that's produced, basically recycled paper that's produced in Nova Scotia, shredded in Nova Scotia, installed in Nova Scotia, and you have thousands more houses, thousands more buildings each year requiring that same insulation. More jobs in that field are created automatically. And what I keep thinking is we need that investment to get us there. If we have comfortable homes for everyone, affordable, reliable, clean electricity, clean air for healthy communities, and the will to act and keep action going, then I think we'll have a brighter future for everyone.
That was great, Ben. Thanks so much for that. I mean, I just want to follow up a bit. Just, you know, we talk about, you know, in transitioning to green jobs, governments have long taken on the role of economic development, right? That we spend a lot of money on economic development. Do you see a role for the province of Nova Scotia in focusing, you know, its economic development, making commitments in terms of what it spends on economic development and you know, where it's putting its resources in that regard? Is it from that end that we need to work, or is it more from making sure, as you say, you talked a lot about training? You know, what should we be asking of our provincial government when it comes to sort of preparing for this green jobs transition, I guess, or helping it come along faster?
Well, there's 4 goals that are outlined in the 19 goal document that's on the Ecology Action Center website. One of them requires a 90% electricity grid, so renewable energy, 90% of the electricity grid being powered by renewable energy by 2030. An increased DSM investment by 2030. Deep energy upgrades of the eligible social housing in Nova Scotia, so that's housing controlled and managed by Housing Nova Scotia, and an increase in zero emission vehicles in Nova Scotia. Those are 4 goals that we outlined in that document. And what they do is they encourage a number of things on the side. What Nova Scotia also needs to do is, right now there's a lot of focus on forestry, a lot of focus on trying to attract mining. And those are big job creators in a short-term case, and they create a lot of jobs in one site, but not jobs everywhere. And what I think is a better investment, or a better time to be spending, focusing our attention on, is looking at those smaller businesses, those smaller industries that manufacture something that is actually natural or renewable. The interesting thing is that we have building materials here in Nova Scotia, such as wall paneling made out of recycled pop bottles, that is actually a wanted and very expensive material in other provinces, just because there's not a lot of production here, and yet there's so much demand everywhere else. So imagine if we actually invested more in those types of technologies to create a workforce and businesses that are exporting away out of Nova Scotia, rather than trying to essentially, well, dig our natural resources out of the ground.
Thanks for that, Ben. I'm going to move on yet again. It always seems every time I end one person's thing, I think, well, we could talk more about this, but well, we're going to move on because we have another guest speaker, Sarah Balloch, the Clean Transportation Manager at Clean Foundation. It's Balloch, sorry. I asked her how to say her name anyway. Sarah has a passion for creative problem solving and maximizing social value opportunities. She has 10 years of experience working in public outreach and engagement surrounding energy efficiency and clean transportation. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi,
Hi there.
thank you.
Can you start off speaking about the transition to electric vehicles and the role that they play in a sustainable future?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys so much for inviting me today. This is excellent. I think the really important word in your question is transition, as we are transitioning to a more sustainable future that hopefully sees lots of public transportation and active transportation. We kind of need a piece in there in between, because right now our community's infrastructure really reflects the usage of personal vehicles. So that switch to EV is really important. And as a lot of people on this have already mentioned, energy efficiency is really important, and an electric vehicle is that switch to a more energy efficient vehicle. Your traditional internal combustion engine, the power that you're getting from that gas, it's working at about 30% efficiency, and that's actually a pretty great internal combustion engine producing that power. An electric vehicle is looking more between the 70 to 80 range, which is a huge savings already that you're going to see in GHG reductions. And that's just the car itself. And then if you look at where that energy is coming from, when you make that shift from gasoline to electricity, you're seeing a huge savings. But also it has this really beautiful thing of, once your electricity is also greening your grid, your fuel for your car is now becoming local as well, which is a really great jump. Right now in Nova Scotia, we have 600,000 light duty vehicles. So if we could switch all of those to EVs, we would see a huge reduction in GHGs. And in Nova Scotia, 1/3 of our GHGs are coming from our transportation sector, which is huge. So we would see a really big savings really quickly. There are all sorts of other really valuable parts to EVs as well. So they don't create the noise pollution, they don't create the air quality, which Ben touched on air quality. So there are all sorts of other great reductions that we can see from EVs. And at Next Ride, so one of our programs in the Clean Transportation Crew is to let people test drive EVs. So a really interesting thing is that the shift to an EV is often something that people feel like it's really different than an internal combustion engine, but it's actually very similar once you get in one. So we allow people to do test drives in EVs so that they can see it's a very similar experience. If anything, a lot of the comments we get are that it's faster, it's got more power behind it, it's so quiet, it's so comfortable. So it's really doing some beautiful things to make that shift. There's some other programs that we're running within clean transportation as well, because we're also mindful of that shift that we're seeing. Of course, if everyone switches to EVs, the job world looks very different. So electrician upskilling is really valuable, as well as other trades roles. Yeah, I think that sort of covers your question.
Yeah. I'm interested in where the best bang for our buck comes when it comes to investing in the infrastructure that we need for electric vehicle technology. I mean, I guess you did mention in the beginning that sort of need to divert away from personal use vehicles sort of dominating as they do, although the reality is that they do. Yeah, where do you think where should the public investments start? What's our best option?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, and it's hard to pinpoint one place. I think the electrification of public transit would be really wonderful. It's a really accessible piece. A lot of people can use it. It continues to have value further down the road. And then another piece that I think has a lot of value too, for lots of folks, range anxiety is what's stopping them from adopting an EV or purchasing an EV. So that's that anxiety that I can't have a charge big enough that it'll get me far enough as far as I want to go. And it's partially because we've grown up on this gas station model of stopping at a gas station to fuel up whenever we feel like it. In reality, most folks are doing 85% of their charging at home. But that's just not what we feel like is what is happening. So investing in more charging stations that are really visible too, so that people can see them. And of course, some folks do need chargers. If you are doing longer drives, if you want to take a road trip down to the valley, things like that, you will need to stop at a charger on your way, just like you would need to stop anywhere else. So investing in charging infrastructure that is really visible for folks would be really helpful in EV adoption.
That's interesting that you point that out. It never occurred to me before, but we won't have as many charging stations, as we currently have gas stations, because, people don't tend to fill up on gas when their car is parked in their driveway every day. So, but with electricity, you start every day sort of with a full tank kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there will be still some need for charging stations for folks who don't have access to garages, to plugins, to personal parking spots, things like that. And of course, then those folks who are going on longer road trips, which is another reason why the charging infrastructure is really helpful, because we do have a lot of people in Nova Scotia who don't have necessarily a driveway, or they live in an apartment building or condo where they can't plug in right there. So it's still a really helpful piece for those folks as well who do want to make the switch but can't quite figure out the logistics yet.
Mm-hmm. I was curious, and just one more quick question before we get to the Q&A here. How do we square investing in EV infrastructure with the coexisting need to reduce that transportation energy demand overall? I'm thinking in the small town that I live right now, there's a resurfacing debate about drive-throughs, and some of the comments are, well, everyone's going to have EVs, so we can have as many drive-throughs as we want now. Is there a tension there when you're thinking about that EV investment? How do you square that?
Yeah, you guys have lots of great questions. This is excellent. I mean, I think it squares itself to some degree because there is just such a high efficiency in electric vehicles versus internal combustion engines. So you just automatically kind of see that happening. But I think some of the really interesting parts are, sorry, I completely lost my train of thought there. Just a sec.
No worries. I mean, I know that you mentioned investing in public transit, electrification, and maybe we make up for it on that end, possibly making sure that we're investing in electrification a lot on the sort of more efficiency of use kind of transportation networks that we, should be investing in. Yeah,
I think that's a great point. Like investing in more large scale electrification makes sense, and it helps start that conversation too about transit. And I think looking at what that looks like for rural communities as well is helpful, because it is beneficial in those communities, in those smaller communities.
I'm going to leave you on the hot seat for a minute, Sarah. As we move into the question period, please, people, just post a question in the chat. I believe someone's monitoring the Facebook Live chat window as well, and we're sort of putting all the questions together. There is one for you, Sarah. Someone is asking, this is Ali on Facebook, she's asking for thoughts on how EV subsidies can be made more accessible for people at lower income levels. So this is a really interesting one, because right now there's that perception that EVs are for the rich. So yeah, what kind of work is being done in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. So here in Nova Scotia, we do have a rebate program for EVs and e-bikes. And the way that our program actually works is that it works for used EVs as well. So that helps. So the subsidy is, or the rebate is, attempting to bring it to price parity for folks buying EVs, so that it looks more like the cost of buying any vehicle. And then adding in that used piece helps bring it to a more accessible level, because there is, of course, some inherent privilege to being able to own a car, but in a lot of Nova Scotia, and for a lot of Nova Scotians, it's also a necessity. So trying to make it as fair as possible through using that method.
All right, thanks so much, Sarah. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back to Louise for a moment. This is something that was actually answered in the chat, Louise, but it was an interesting question and answer. So I'm going to mention it here for everyone to hear. Brian Gifford had said, it sounds as if the publicly owned NB Power is less publicly accountable than the privately owned NS Power, because NS Power is subject to substantial UARB hearings. And is this correct? Louise, did you want to say a few words about that?
Yes, it is absolutely correct. In fact, just to give you an example of the kind of political interference we have in electricity here, the Premier essentially amended the Electricity Act overnight to prevent NB Power from going to the Energy Utilities Board for its annual rate hearing. And so we have a lot of political interference on the part of the electricity shareholder, as Crown Corp, the Minister of Energy is the primary shareholder. We also, though, have this belief in New Brunswick that public engagement is a distraction. And I don't say that to be rhetorical. I actually say it because that's what ministers tell me, that there's no point in engaging the public on discussions of small modular nuclear because they just won't get it, or we can't engage with them on electricity issues because they just won't get it. And so we have processes that include no public engagement. So that's one aspect that's quite dismissive. The other one that I'm struggling with personally, because I believe in public power, but given the context that we operate in, the reality is that markets where there's more of a requirement to bid into a market and purchase at the margin is leading to more renewable energy coming in than it is here, where a government can say, no, we don't want the cheapest power right now. I'll give you two examples. We had two wind projects competitively bid that came in at less than 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which is a very good price out here, two wind projects, and both of them essentially were knocked off, essentially killed off by NB Power not being very flexible during COVID. So we just have a bad attitude on a lot of fronts, certainly in the province I live in.
New Brunswick is not coming off very well in this webinar, guys.
No, I'm sorry about that. There's hope, potential, but not right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it should be more inspiration for Nova Scotians to, to participate in the public consultations when they have a chance, I guess. There is a question for Emma. Emma, how much money needs to be invested in efficiency in Nova Scotia? What would that money get us? Where could that money be diverted from? And the suggestion is fossil fuel subsidies, possibly?
Yeah, fantastic question. Because I'm saying we got to spend what it takes. Well, what is that? So Ecology Action Center did a report, the electricity report, where it gives a pretty good estimation of how much efficiency we need to invest in. And it's about $1 billion a year for the next 10 years. And you might go, whoa, 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 like that's a lot of money. It is, but it's not that much. We don't ask that when, we spend $500 million on our highways every year. Or as Marie just pointed out in our chat, we spend a ton on national defense. I did want to say, like, when I said national defense, I was like, oh, I am helping them with their greenwashing, but I wanted to not get too much caught up in the military industrial complex conversation today. So I thought I would just not that I let someone else, I'm glad someone else brought it up, that there's a lot of money being spent by national defense on things that are actually harming the planet. But there's a lot of places where that money could come from. But I think it's important that we just start saying spend it and not asking where it's coming from. Because I really, like, as someone who works at different levels of government with different kinds of bureaucrats, we do not ask that question about other things, like even monuments that we spend millions of dollars on that don't really have a really useful purpose. We need to spend this money, because if we don't do this, nothing really matters. Like, we won't have a planet. It's essential spending.
Interesting stuff, Emma. We have another question for you. So, I'm going to keep you on the hot seat for a minute. Someone wants to know, is the situation getting dire enough that governments should implement policies to discourage excess energy use, like, for example, a tiered electricity pricing model that charges more when a user exceeds some sort of household limit. And they suggest the proceeds from that could go into a green fund of some kind. Is that kind of regulation at the household level something that we should be looking at? Has it been tried elsewhere?
I wouldn't think so. No, I think that discriminates against people who already experience energy poverty, and the cost of living is much too high. We can create policies that help the environment, invest in energy efficiency, and also help people. We absolutely know how to do that, like the home warming program, like the deep energy retrofits for renters, investing in public transit. That's also a form of efficiency, especially electrified transit, as Sarah was pointing out. Yeah, I can't, I would find it very challenging to get behind a policy like that, especially if it's implemented across the board to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
There's some people that could afford to pay like a carbon. Yeah, I don't want to answer that, say yes until I think about it more thoroughly. But my immediate reaction is no.
All right. Thanks for that. Sarah, there's a bunch of questions coming in about transportation right now. Someone would like to know, what do you recommend regarding provincial policy to mandate a percentage of vehicles sold as electric? Their concern is that otherwise EVs are not likely to be available here, like that there's a low availability in car lots. Do we need to, should there be provincial regulations saying if you sell cars, you need to sell a certain number of them on your lot has to be electric?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, because I know a lot of people do have that feeling that there's no supply. There is actually a pretty good supply of EVs here for the uptake that's currently happening. But other provinces do have mandates, and that does mean that EVs get sent to their provinces first. That's how manufacturers divvy it out. If you have a mandate, you have to have EVs on your lot to sell them to meet that target. So it is beneficial to have mandates. If the communities are ready to purchase the EVs, the mandates are very helpful.
Okay. There's another question wondering about the sort of difference or the balance of investment between private electric vehicles and investment in public electric transportation. The concern is that by maintaining the norm of private vehicle ownership, there's a potential for car manufacturing corporations to maintain financial and political power by maintaining the norm of private transport over public transport. This person is asking for comment on how different and better our communities could be if the conversation and focus shifted to robust public transit, including rural areas. Someone else earlier had mentioned, getting creative, focusing on smaller buses, more transit for disabled, taxi-like services. These are types of things that are happening in rural areas. I know in Nova Scotia, there's a number of non-for-profits that operate sort of dial-a-ride type services. And I know that those types of organizations certainly are interested in electrification, just for the reduction in operating costs that you can get. I guess the question is, are we investing enough in public transportation, in electrification on the public side versus the private side? I don't want to put you on the hot seat again, Sarah, but comment if you have a comment, please go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think that's like a huge question with so many, a variety of answers, because of course, urban public transportation looks completely different than rural public transportation. And you're right, there's some really great rural transportation groups out there that are looking into electrification, because another point that you made actually is that the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle is significantly lower than an internal combustion engine, because there are less things to break down. You never have to worry about things like oil, or like there's just a huge array of why it's actually another one of the unfortunate parts is, yes, there's a big upfront cost, but your total cost of ownership is so significantly lower. So that's a huge reason, which that's the maintenance side. And then the actual fueling the vehicle side is you're having huge savings there too. So I can comment a little bit on that piece. And I think we would see that same savings in larger public transportation, but it's also a very like sticky, tricky, thorny problem that I don't have a direct answer to.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting. I do know that the provincial government takes on funding those smaller rural transportation groups a bit more than the municipalities do, but the provincial government in Nova Scotia is not well known for funding its larger public transportation. Like, for example, Halifax Transit does not get a significant amount of money from the provincial government. So I suppose, there's definitely room for investment there. We are running low on questions here. I would, I would like to go back to Louise for just a minute to touch back on the vision for energy, for electricity in the Atlantic provinces. You talked a bit, Louise, about the potential for a sort of, for Atlantic cooperation. Do we need more sort of initiatives like we have going on, during COVID-19 with the provinces cooperating on things like the bubble? They're in communication constantly. Do we need to see a similar level of commitment and cooperation amongst the provinces to really be able to see major changes in how we supply our electricity in the Atlantic provinces?
Yes, we do. There was also a question in the chat that kind of asked about the balance between the policy political side versus technology, because we've talked a lot about the technology side. So let me just respond to that question, which I thought was a really good question in the context of your question, Erica. Yeah. I guess the first thing I want to say is we all have a tendency to fall into what we call technology optimism. And I would say on climate change, like so many other issues, it's actually our citizenship that matters more. And the question was, what are we doing to educate the public? Well, the one way you educate the public is you let them participate. One of the key things Quebec has done, for example, is it's had several energy commissions that tour the province and engage the public in debate and decision around the future of the electricity system in that province. And that's what we need regionally. We need to engage the population and to see themselves as citizens that have a role and a stake in what happens with our electricity system. We also need, I think, new regional institutions. I actually think we need to have, in New Brunswick, the debt load, for example, for NB Power is so high, it can't make any new decisions really about very much without figuring out how it's going to solve its problems first and foremost around dealing with revenue. Do we actually need an Atlantic utility? We are 4 small provinces. Do we need an Atlantic regional electricity planning body? Do we need an energy efficiency agency for the Atlantic? Why not? And so I think the conversations around Atlantic Loop give us an opportunity to kind of put that forward, but it also requires that we watch our own tendencies to be technology optimists and not underestimate the social and political barriers that we face. This is not a technology problem. It's there. We have to find other solutions. On the question of cost, here's one thing I just want to say around why education is so important. Every time politicians threaten ratepayers with this will be unaffordable, electricity rates are going to skyrocket, it's as if the conversation can't go any further. But the reality is that we can have high electricity rates and low electricity bills because of the investments that we've been talking about, whether it's on the vehicle or transportation side, whether it's on the home energy use or building energy use, whether it's the supply side. And so we have to have more honest conversations about challenging what we think are these untouchable principles, that everybody has the right to cheap power. Actually, we probably don't, because cheap power is polluting power. And so how do we talk about what needs to happen in a short period of time that deals with justice issues, effects on low-income households, but actually makes what we call now the polluter elite, a fantastic report from Cambridge University yesterday, 5% of the global population responsible for 30% of global emissions, 34% of global emissions. We have a polluter elite that needs to pay its fair share. And how do we deal with that? So I think we have to challenge our operating premises and think differently. And that means integrating in a way in the Atlantic that we're not comfortable with. And that means we're going to have to challenge ourselves and how we do things and the political processes that we rely on, as well as the institutions that make decisions.
Thanks for that, Louise. We have a question here from John on Facebook, and Louise, this could be for you. Who is responsible to build green energy infrastructure resources in Nova Scotia? Why not have provincially funded development, or must it be done by private interests? Can the province supply? Can we use provincial money to do this?
Yes. So, and I, being the New Brunswick person, I'll just share my thought on what I think this issue is about. And I'll let my Nova Scotia colleagues also respond. But this is such an important question. I looked at this whole question of green jobs as well a couple of years ago, and where they come from and so on. And here's a question that hit me. Why is it okay for, in our case, our utilities to have as utility-owned assets, coal plants, oil plants, gas plants, hydro plants, but not renewable energy and not efficiency? When it comes to wind, when it comes to efficiency, that's contracted out to the private sector. That's not an asset in my jurisdiction that NB Power owns, for example. Nuclear is a public asset. Hydro dams are a public asset. Why don't we have the same investment, the same commitment to union jobs, well-paying good jobs, by ensuring that NB Power owns the windmills, NB Power owns the solar utility scale operations, that NB Power owns the efficiency benefits, if you will. So, the whole model of how we think about efficiency and renewables also needs to be challenged while we're at it. At least in the context of New Brunswick.
Emma, did you want to chime in at all on that question? Not to put you on the spot.
I mean, Louise always says everything so well. The only thing I will get people to think about, because this climate crisis requires so much imagination, is that we can start thinking about investing in our built environment like investing in public infrastructure, if we think about the public good that it does to invest in deep energy retrofits. So I think that's really where Louise was going, and kind of another way of saying what she said. But and I can see her nodding. I know the audience can't say that, so she agrees. But that's the only thing I'd add.
All right. I want to ask if any of the panelists have any final thoughts, like based on the discussion we've had. Anything you'd like to contribute before we wind up? Joanna from the EAC has some final words, so don't go away. But before that, does anyone have anything they'd like to say?
I could add something if I can say one more thing.
Please go ahead.
Nova Scotia has declared a climate emergency. A lot of our municipalities have, but none of them are actually acting like we're in an emergency. And in order to do that, they need to start telling the truth about how much greenhouse gas emissions they're emitting. They need to start spending what it takes. They need to start making these climate policies mandatory, not opt-in, and making it easy as possible for folks to get involved, and start creating new economic institutions. Like, they need to make publicly funded, we need to start producing our own wind turbines, our own panels for construction, our own EVs, and those all would need to be associated with good unionized, well-paying jobs. And so I just want to, we need to really start sounding the alarm that, like, if we're in emergency mode, we need to start acting like it. And that means investing in this energy transition we talked about today.
Thanks so much, Emma. Anyone else have a few final thoughts? Ben Grieder, do you have anything you wanted to wrap up with?
Actually, no, I'm all right. Emma said what I think that I want people to take away with. So.
All right. All right, sounds good. Sarah Balloch, anything?
I agree. It's a group of wonderfully well-spoken people and saying everything that I'm thinking. So maybe just some, again, gratitude for inviting me. I have learned a lot from this panel. Thank you guys so much.
All right. Louise, last chance to weigh in.
Sure. I mean, I guess, just to kind of encourage people to be courageous. The time for negotiation is kind of over, and I think we need to be confident in being radical about what we're talking about and challenging the status quo. The time for, incremental change, sorry, but that was a long time ago. That's gone. We need radical, deep, and rapid change. And we just need to get our game on and be confident about pushing for that. And that includes voting for politicians that are sincere and serious about climate action. And so just remember that it's about your citizenship as well as how you choose to live as a consumer. And put citizenship first.
I just want to say thanks to all the speakers today. I really appreciate your knowledge and your time. And I want to say apologies to any questions I may have missed. Hopefully we got to some of them. And I know there's some questions and answers going on in the chat. So best of luck with that. Many thanks to the Ecology Action Center for organizing this whole event. I'm going to turn it on over back over to Joanna to wrap things up for us finally and, talk a bit about, I guess, what the next steps are for everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica, and for guiding us through that conversation so beautifully once again. And I've learned a lot from listening to all of our speakers tonight. So many really great ideas for things that we can demand from our government. I was writing down whole lists of them. Better transparency in decision making, so that people are actually consulted in the way these decisions happen. Having the profit model for Nova Scotia Power be based on their performance at reducing emissions and not how much electricity they can sell. Having a good energy efficiency target, doubling our efficiency every year. Making sure that our utility and review board needs to include reducing emissions and climate considerations in their decision-making processes. Installing that infrastructure for electric vehicle charging, electrifying our transit, getting some provincial money for transit and those kinds of things. And most importantly, for all of us to be radical and courageous and to activate our citizenship in this moment so that we can build the kind of political power that we need to really lead the politicians. We often look for leadership from our politicians, but I think they can really only do as much as their electorate is pushing them for. So that's our job. So hopefully you also got lots of ideas. These are the kinds of things we hope that people speak up for really loud and clear when the public consultations do happen. Hopefully soon. We've been waiting for them for a long time, but we think they're happening soon for our climate plan and the regulations of the Sustainable Development Goals Act. So hopefully this gave you lots of inspiration and thoughts for there, and we'll definitely keep in touch. Stay tuned for our next webinar on protecting ecosystems and on climate adaptation. So we'll be in touch with all of you. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.